everyone, and welcome to my channel. I'm the Renaissance Man, and today I'm going to be doing a tier list of medieval armaments. And I suppose I haven't really given a good overview of my channel so far, although I've posted a few videos now. So I'm mostly just going to be posting videos about what I'm interested in, and I'm going to try to post a video about every week with a short, usually going to be a concertina short every week, just to show my progress on the concertina. The regular videos are just going to be things I'm interested in. So far I've done one on Viking Sunstones, one on the Fermi Paradox. This one's going to be about medieval weapons. I think I'm going to do one about a zombie apocalypse, how to survive a zombie apocalypse next week. So if you're interested in that, um, please subscribe if you want to keep seeing more. Another big one I have in the works, it's going to be a pretty large project, so it's still subject to change. It's still in the early phases, but I'm going to be making about 10 or 20 video games, and I'm going to try to do that in either 20 or 30 days to see, or maybe I'll give myself a set number of hours to try and do that as sort of a challenge video to see what kind of games I can make in those 30 days. So let's get started with this tier list. We just have a selection of medieval weapons down at the bottom here. I meant to include shield. I think I'll add that in a second. But to start, we have the sword, and I think swords are really cool. So I am gonna put it probably towards the S tier. And this ranking isn't like going to be just how functional the weapon is. It's also just going to be how cool I think it is. But there is a certain functionality will impact it. So if even if it's something I don't think personally is as cool, I'm still going to put it in a respectable tier because if it was a very functional. And swords pretty cool. I personally like the two-handed swords, great swords, bastard swords, anything like that. But really, any kind of sword I think is pretty cool. They're kind of like the staple in any kind of fantasy or medieval media that you see. Everyone's gonna have a sword. They're kind of the most popular. In actual history, they were a little less popular. They required a lot of metal, very high skill to make, which does make them slightly less functional. And in combat, only like the knights and the rich would have swords, and even then, if they're on horseback, they typically use some kind of lance or spear, unless they were in close combat, closer range combat. And swords are very good against anyone unarmored. With the cutting, they're very effective there. They do offer quite a bit of versatility. You can hold them in the Mordha, where you hold it by the blade and use the hilt as a bludgeoning tool. The hilt allows you to give some basic defense with the sword. You can also half-hand it, so where you hold one hand on the hilt and one halfway up the blade to give you a little more precision, which can work well in smaller corridors. If you have a big sword, it can also help you find the gaps in people's armor. So for that reason, I'm going to put them in S. Up next is going to be the mace. This one I don't think I'm going to go put as high. A lot of the things that a mace is good at can be accomplished with other weapons. It has its purposes, but I think I'm going to put it in the C tier. So with a mace, it is very good at getting through like plate armor and even padded armor. It's pretty good at that. But most of what a mace can do, you can still accomplish with a sword. With the sword, you can still like Mordha, hit with the hilt, anything like that. It still can bypass armor if you hit hard enough with it. Mace is just a little bit simpler design, a little easier to make. You can even like get a club and it'll function similar to a mace. Instead of cutting, it's going to be more of a crushing, breaking bones, stuff like that. Um, it's pretty cool with like Sauron in the Lord of the Rings movies does have a mace, which is pretty cool. So it's still like a cool armament, but it's going to be a more specialized use, and I just personally don't think it's as cool. If you disagree, let me know in the comments, but we're going to keep going. Spear. I think I'm going to put Spear in A tier. I'd like to kind of spread it out a little, but it's very close to S, kind of like borderline AS tier for me. Spears are going to be kind of the staple weapon of any medieval army. They require very little metal to make, making them very accessible to most people. very quick to make. You only have to make a small blade at the end, and you don't really have to have a ton of training to use one effectively, unlike a sword, which requires a lot of training to be very effective with. The spear, you kind of just hold and point it at one. It keeps people at range very well unless they know what they're doing, which works well for any like basic infantry. Like if they've recruited any like peasant armies, the spear is going to be great. The spear, it's also kind of been getting higher for me recently. I've been reading Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, and if any of you have read that, you'll know that the spear, Kaladin uses the spear a lot, and Kaladin's pretty cool in his books, which kind of elevates the spear to be kind of the level of sword where it's seen in like a lot more fantasy. Especially recently, I've been seeing spear in a lot more of those fantasy books and some TV shows now, and they're making it more of a flashier weapon, kind of like that sword where like knights are using it, or like maybe not knights, but like warriors, main characters. It's becoming more of a common weapon in fantasy for main characters to use, which makes it pretty cool, especially to see it in more action nowadays. Um, we'll also include pikes in the spear category, which Alexander the Great, the 15-foot pikes, when if you have really long pikes, it's kind of hard to get past them, which makes it really good, especially for any phalanx formations, like with the Romans. They're pretty good if there's any cavalry charges. Um, on both ends, you can use lances on the cavalry, which is risky to the people riding the horses, but it's definitely worse to people trying to defend against that. So overall, I'd put a spear in A tier, a very versatile weapon, and pretty solid to use in most circumstances. Up next is going to be the trebuchet and really all siege weapons. I think they'll put them in B. They have a more specialized purpose, so I'm going to move them down a little for that. I think I'm going to move spear up to S tier actually, just because of how versatile it is, how common it is. Everyone used a spear. It's just a really functional weapon. And back to siege weapons. They're really very specialized. You're going to be using them when you siege a castle, or they're going to be using one when they siege a castle. They have the engineers building them, so not as flashy. They're not necessarily going to be the warriors manning them. It might be more engineering, but very cool. He also has some funny stories with them, like during the when the conquistadors tried to were invading we're going to the Americas and trying to invade Tenochtitlan, and they didn't have any engineers with them, so they built a trebuchet themselves, and it launched the rock straight up in the air and came back down and crushed it. And both sides have both the Aztecs and the conquistadors wrote that down in their annals, which is pretty cool. It's a pretty funny story, and so these are going to be very specialized. They're great at taking down walls, but a little harder to aim at any moving target. They're not really going to be great. But for a lot of for any kind of sieging or anything like that, they're going to be really versatile and really useful for that. Up next, we have the crossbow. I'm also going to put that in the B tier. Very, very versatile. Reduced the training from the bow, made it a much more accessible to people. Um, you didn't really need to have as much training with a crossbow as you do with a bow. It was just kind of point and shoot, which made it a lot more accessible to armies, required a lot less training. They had a pretty powerful force. They might not have the same, especially medieval crossbows might not have the same as like a longbow per se, or a recurve bow, but they'll still have enough force to deal with most threats. Once you get into Gambeson, they're a little less effective because Gambeson was kind of specifically designed to stop those arrows. But the same with a longbow. So like the Viking Gambeson and the Gambeson, due to the padded nature of it, it made it a lot more effective at stopping arrows. I might do a video on that at some point. But anyways, I'll put crossbow in B. Again, not as flashy as the bow. You have like Legolas with the bow. Ranger's Apprentice has a lot of bows. They're very popular. Any kind of ranger character is going to be using a bow most of the time. Crossbow a little less popular. You do see it, especially in a lot of games nowadays. It's a pretty cool design. It's very influential with the winch system. But overall, I'm going to put it in B tier. Alright, and moving on to the next one, we have the bow and arrow. I think I'm going to put that in the A tier. Bow and arrow is a very influential weapon. You got the longbow, which is seen a lot in fantasy. I believe Legolas uses a longbow. It might be a recurve bow, though. You see it in Ranger's Apprentice. Again, also very influential in history. You had the Battle of Agincourt, where the English longbows were very very useful against the French nobility, the French knights. Um, I believe that was Agincourt. There may be another one that I'm thinking of here, but the longbow, with how powerful it was able to punch through the plate armor, which was huge in that time, where a longbow was almost a peasant's weapon, and they were able to take out the nobility there. Even recurve bows, also incredible advancement in the technology, used in like feudal Japan. The samurai with the recurve bows were able to use them while mounted. Same with the Mongols, able to use them mounted, made them much more versatile than the longbow. They normally had a little bit of a trade-off in power, but not enough to be that noticeable, especially when you're like riding on horseback. It doesn't really matter if you lose a little power. Is even with the laws of physics, if you're riding at them, you can still get that kind of same level of power because the horse's speed also impacts it, but much more maneuverable. Makes it a little hard to stop. They could honestly be a S tier. I think I'm just gonna put them in A tier. They're a little less flashy than some of these other ones. They're long range, but again, it requires a high level of skill to use bows, high level skill in crossbow. But overall, I'm gonna put them in the A tier. All right, and up next we have the pole arms. So this is a pretty wide category, pretty similar to the spear. You have good reach with it. Most famous of these are going to be like the halberd. We have the axe blade on the end with a spear point. There's a few others here, like glaives, pikes, or partisans. Sorry, not pikes. Um, I think I'll put this in B tier as well. Um, they just have a much higher like skill level than the spear, much more difficult to use because of the combination of tips. You can have slashing, piercing, even bludgeoning on some of them. Like a crow's beak might even be able to be considered a pole arm, where you have the hammer and the spike on the side. So I'm gonna put that in B tier. Very versatile, but also you need to be very well trained in these, which is gonna kind of move it down a bit. Up next we have the handgun. Um, this was I believe it was created in Germany, at least as a German name, um, during like feudal Germany. Um, so it was front loaded with gunpowder, and it was essentially a gun, um, a little less sophisticated than even like flintlocks. It was essentially a cannon that you held in your hand, although a much smaller barrel, and really really cool. Um, so I'm tempted to move it up, but it did suffer from um, that very slow reload time from having to be front loaded like a musket, also kind of like a cannon. If you didn't time it correctly, you weren't going to hit anyone with it. Very, very devastating though when it was used effectively. But if it wasn't at a certain range, it was only a small range of effectiveness. Too far away, the smooth bore of the barrel would make the shot miss. If they were too close, you couldn't reload fast enough, so you only got one shot off. Devastating for one or two shots, but other than that, you couldn't really use it too much. Up next is going to be this dagger. I think I am going to put dagger pretty low here, probably D tier. Daggers are pretty cool. Assassins, if you play D&D, rogues love daggers. If you got throwing daggers, but again, throwing daggers, we have the axe later. I think a throwing axe is just going to be better than a throwing dagger in pretty much any situation where you need to throw a weapon. Although the dagger is going to be a bit easier to store on your person. Um, you can use it in close range combat, even against armor. Um, Depending on how you hold it, you can make it a little better for trying to puncture through chainmail. You can slash a bit with it. Overall, it's just not going to be. It's essentially a less effective sword in most circumstances. Close range, it works well. If the character needs something hidden, it's pretty effective. But normally, it's going to be kind of like a last resort type weapon. You're typically going to want to use it most in medieval times. They typically use a sword or a spear and then a sword, and then the dagger would kind of be their last option. Even in many role playing games, fantasy, video games, the knife or dagger is going to be your second or third option most of the time. You don't really want that as your primary option, just because it's a little less versatile. Um, Typically, you want to keep them as far away from as possible whenever you're fighting someone, video game, whatever. So with the dagger, if it gets too close, not ideal. Very short range. Typically, you don't want a very short range for medieval weapons. They want to keep them as far away, which is why spears were great, kept them far away. Longbows even better, kept them even farther away. But also, it depends on how cool I think it is. Daggers can be pretty cool, but ultimately going to go in D tier. Then we have the gauntlet. Pretty cool, but ultimately has to go in F tier. If that's the only weapon that the character has, the only weapon being used, barely even a weapon, not going to work too well. It's going to be pretty ineffective. It's bludgeoning, it's made of metal, which is nice, but you have to get so close, and there's only so much force, it doesn't give you any leverage on it, which kind of limits its capabilities. Next is the hammer. I think I'll put it just above the mace in B tier. B tier is kind of overloaded here. I might move one of these up. We can look at that in a second. Hammer is just going to kind of be a longer ranged mace. It's got a little bit of smaller head, which allows more pounds per square inch when striking. The impact is going to be a little greater. Typically has a spike on the other side too. If you have like a war pick style or a crow's beak, is going to be pretty effective against lots of plate armor, even chain armor. Even the chain armor kind of disperses the force of the impact. Still going to be pretty devastating when you have that very small impact with a long handle. Just like kind of like how physics will work, it's going to be very effective. Next to the axe, and I think axe is going to go in S tier here. We'll put it in A actually. Axe typically, it works very well. Pretty solid against like any shields, and very very common during like medieval times, ancient times. Everyone had an axe to cut wood for fire, for warmth in the winter, so everyone was going to have access to one of these, which makes it very very versatile. Everyone's going to have it. Everyone's going to roughly know how to use it, even if not for combat. They're kind of going to have it. You got the stereotypical Viking war axe, which is very cool. It's effective. Pretty much all of these are going to be effective, but the axe is just a pretty solid tool and weapon. The fact that it can be used as a tool kind of elevates it a bit more. It's very borderline S tier. I think I'll put it right in the middle here. The It's going to be great against armor, shields, pretty much anything. It's got a smaller impact than like the sword, but it's also, because you swing it, it has a little more force than the spear. Good middle ground, solid choice. It does require a relatively high amount of skill to use effectively in combat. So if it's like a knight with a sword, and it's like a peasant with an axe, not going to turn out too great for the peasant. But for most circumstances, it's very very common, which is going to make it a pretty solid medieval armament. And then last but not least, I just added this in. Shield, I forgot about when first making it. I'm going to put shield in A tier. That one I'm pretty certain on. Not necessarily a weapon in like the stereotypical sense, which is kind of why we expanded to armaments. You also have like siege weapons in here, which it's a little easier to put them under armaments. Some people might not consider them in the same category as these other ones. Same with the gauntlet. But the shield, it's going to be great, very great for defense. It's hard to get around a shield. Axe with the axe with like the hooked end kind of can kind of pull it down, which sucks if you have the shield. Not as prevalent. Again, shields are not going to be as prevalent in fantasy. Most of these other ones, there's some kind of like legendary equivalent in any kind of mythology or fantasy books. As for swords, you have a ton. You have the Shard Blades in Brandon Sanderson. You have Excalibur. Spears, again, you have Sylphrina in Stormlight Archive. There's some other ones. The bows, I'm not as familiar with, but Legolas uses a bow. Even if there's not like a legendary version, you at least see them. Axes used very prolifically by Vikings. You have Keenfire in the Dwarves series by Marcus Heights, which is a pretty solid series I'd recommend. Shield is a little more constrained in where you see it. You are going to see it a bit in the Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames, which is a book I really recommend if you like Dungeons and Dragons, if you like any kind of like rock music. It kind of ties those themes into it. It's really cool. The main character uses a shield. Um, Shields can be like you have Captain America uses a shield, so I proved myself wrong there. It is used quite often. Great for defense. You can throw it, I guess, like a frisbee if you really want to. Probably not recommended in like any like fantasy settings, medieval settings. They probably weren't throwing their shields, but Captain America can do it, which is pretty cool. Um, and then you can also it helps block arrows, which is pretty solid. You can kind of use it as a bludgeoning tool. Um, isn't it keep people alive, keeps medieval soldiers alive, keeps fantasy characters alive, anything like that. Dungeons and Dragons, I believe, adds a point or two to your AC, which is very, very helpful all the time. Makes it a bit hard to hit you, which is really great for most practical applications. Alright, so this is going to be my tier list. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you disagree, agree, anything like that, I'd be happy to hear your opinions. Kind of did this quickly. You might be able to change my mind pretty easily with some of these. And if leave suggestions on what kind of videos you want to see if the leave some suggestions on what kind of videos you want to see in the future if you like this kind of content. This is a little longer. If you want more of those educational videos I was putting out, even video games, I'm really open to anything. So whatever you'd be interested in, let me know in the comments, and I hope you like this video, and I'll see you next time if you want to keep watching.